These are 3 flour alternatives that we can grow on our own property that we have experimented with. War, train strikes, raising transportation prices, and a greater number of adverse weather conditions like droughts all affect our ability to get wheat on our table. Wheat is a big part of the average diet. The average North American eats about 180 pounds of wheat a year, which accounts for up to 20% of all the calories we consume. If you wanted to step out of the food supply chain for wheat and grow your own, you would need about 3 bushels or about 3,000 square feet of garden space per person dedicated only to wheat. For most of us, that is just not feasible. But removing wheat completely from our diet isn't the only way to deal with this. Let's turn to the 3 R's of food security: resilience, resistance, and redundancy. Deciding to grow your own wheat is a form of resistance to disturbances in the supply chain. Another way to reduce the amount of wheat you need is to switch from white flour to whole wheat flour. White flour only uses the endosperm of the grain, and whole wheat flour also uses the casing or bran, allowing you to get twice as much flour from the same amount of wheat. We can also resist disturbances to the wheat food supply chain by reducing our own dependence on wheat. You can reduce that a lot by just removing wheat from several meals a week and replacing it with other starchy vegetables such as potatoes or corn or carrots. We can also reduce our dependence on wheat through redundancy in the different types of grains and flours that we buy, forage, and grow. Ideally, you would replace wheat with alternative sources of flours that are adapted and resilient to your local climate. 3 different flours that we have experimented include squash, beans, and dockweed. Squash grows like crazy here and doesn't need that much work, or even garden space. Squash plants do take up a lot of space, but we plant them on the edge of the garden and train the vines to grow out into areas without good soil. Squash spreading outside the garden suppresses weeds near the garden, breaks up the ground around the garden by setting roots, and adds nutrients to the bare ground when it decomposes at the end of the year, allowing us to expand our gardens more the next year. You can also grow them up trellises to save space. We bake and then dehydrate squashes like pumpkins. This severely reduces the amount of space that squashes take up in the pantry and increases their longevity. If you put the dehydrated chunks in a food grinder, you essentially get flour. To keep the same consistency as using wheat flour, we have found that you can replace up to half of the wheat flour in cakes and muffins and about 1/4 of the flour in breads. Because pumpkin is very flavorful, we find that we need to use less than other squashes like yellow squash or zucchini that have much less flavor, not to overwhelm the dish. When using it for baking, it is important to realize that squash flour weighs more than wheat flour, so you need to use volumetric, not weight-based measurements. We have also experimented with bean flours in noodles. We really like to grow beans. They do not take up a lot of space in the garden either because, like squash, you can grow the indeterminate varieties with vines up trellises. Beans are also great for your soil. They have a symbiotic relationship with soil bacteria, which allows them to convert atmospheric nitrogen into ammonium nitrogen, which they release into the soil. We use a mixture of different beans which we grind up into a flour in the coffee grinder. We have made noodles that replace about 1/3 of the wheat flour as well as only bean flour. When only using bean flour, you need to use more eggs to keep the consistency, which is a great way to use up extra eggs from your chickens when they're going full swing in the spring and summer. The pasta tastes great. The only issue being that it crumbles easier than wheat pasta, so you can't make as long of noodles. The final flour that we have experimented with is broadleaf and curly dock flour. This one is great because it doesn't take up any garden space as it is a weed. Dock is part of the buckwheat family and was introduced to North America from Europe. It grows just about everywhere and it only spreads by seed. But as I said, this is not a native plant, so if you remove all the seeds, you do not have to worry about harming a native species. Although abundant, we avoid the dock that is growing along roadsides due to possible contamination, but there are quite a few plants that grow on our property that we harvest. We leave the chaff on the seeds, which grinds into a flour-like consistency, but because the seeds are so small, they tend to stay whole. We have baked it in muffins, pancakes, and crackers, and only tend to replace about 1/4 of the flour because of the texture it adds. We are looking into getting a small flour mill, and if we do, that will increase the amount of things that we can add dock flour to. These are 3 flour alternatives that we can grow on our own property that we have experimented with. Let us know if you have used other flour substitutes that you grew yourself, as we are always interested in increasing our redundancy in flours as a way to reduce our reliance on wheat.